All right, members of the jury, remain standing, okay? Give me just one moment. The gallery and the parties may be seated. Members of the jury, you were sworn in before we left at our last session. Does everyone still reaffirm their oath? All right, you may be seated. Good morning. All right, outside of your presence, we've been doing some work that hopefully will ensure that the trial will go smoothly. We've been working, that is both sides and the court have been working to make sure that we can get some housekeeping matters taken care of so that when we start the trial, it will occur more smoothly. You know that I like to talk to you all about schedule, so let me let you know what your morning is going to look like. This morning, this court is going to open the proceedings with the preliminary instructions. After I read those to you, the lawyers, if they wish, will give an opening statement. A note about, and a reminder, I know it's been some time since we've seen each other, that I am the judge of the law, and you all are the judges of fact. Our roles do not overlap in any way. However, this court's purpose is to guide you with the law. Once I decide what laws apply to the case, you will see that I will be reading to you quite a bit. I mention that because it's a little bit unnatural to have someone read to you. So once I decide what laws apply, I read them to you. And so the preliminary instructions are meant to guide you through the trial process. They are meant to introduce you to the procedures that you will see throughout the entire trial. So the preliminary instructions, I'm going to ask that you listen to them. And at one point in time, I'm going to pause in just a moment to let you do some things with your notepad, okay? However, I'm going to fast forward to the end of the proceedings where this court will give you the final instructions on the law. Those final instructions will be both read to you and they will be published for you right on the screens in front of you so that you can follow along. The final instructions are more technical and you will have a copy of those instructions to help you during deliberations. And so I've confirmed with both sides, that is both the state of Florida and the defense in this case, that they are ready to proceed. So this court will open with the preliminary instructions. Members of the jury, you have been selected and sworn as the jury to try the case of the state of Florida versus Mario Fernandez Saldana. This is a criminal case. The defendant has been charged with the crimes of murder in the first degree and solicitation to commit a capital felony. The definitions of those crimes will be explained to you later. You must decide this case based on the evidence presented and the law that I will give to you. Evidence consists of the sworn testimony of witnesses, exhibits admitted into evidence, and anything else that I tell you that you may consider as evidence. Your verdict must be based solely on the evidence or the lack of evidence and the law. The state's charging document, which is called an indictment, is not evidence, and it is not to be considered by you as any proof of the defendant's guilt. I will now explain the different roles that the court and the jury perform during the course of a trial. It is my responsibility to explain the law to you. It is your solemn responsibility to determine if the state proved its accusations beyond a reasonable doubt against the defendant in accordance with the law that I will provide to you. Thus, the province of the jury and the province of the court are well defined and they do not overlap. This is one of the fundamental principles of our system of justice. Before proceeding further, it will be helpful if you understand how a trial is conducted. At the beginning of the trial, the attorneys will have an opportunity, if they wish, to make an opening statement. The opening statement gives the attorneys a chance to tell you what evidence they believe will be presented during the trial. What the lawyers say is not evidence, and you are not to consider it as such. Following the opening statements, witnesses will be called to testify under oath. They will be examined and cross-examined by the attorneys. Documents and other exhibits also may be produced as evidence. After the evidence has been presented, the attorneys will have an opportunity to make their closing arguments. Following the closing arguments by the attorneys, the court will instruct you on the law applicable to the case. After the final instructions are given, you will then retire to consider your verdict. In every criminal proceeding, a defendant has the absolute right to remain silent. At no time is it the duty of a defendant to prove his innocence. From the exercise of a defendant's right to remain silent, a jury is not permitted to draw any inference of guilt, and the fact that a defendant did not take the witness stand must not influence your verdict in any manner whatsoever. The attorneys are trained in the rules of evidence and trial procedure, and it is their duty to make all objections that they feel are proper. When an objection is made, you should not speculate on the reason why it is made. Likewise, when an objection is sustained or upheld by me, you must not speculate on what might have occurred had the objection not been sustained, nor what a witness might have said had the witness been permitted to answer. During the trial, it may be necessary for me to confer with the attorneys outside of your hearing to discuss matters that require my consideration alone. It is impossible to predict when such conferences may be required or how long it will last. When such conferences occur, they will be conducted so as to consume as little of your time as necessary for a fair and orderly trial of this case. Please feel free to stand and stretch if you need to while I'm talking to the attorneys. You all have been provided a notepad and a pen for your use if you wish to take notes. If you would like to take notes during the trial, you may do so. On the other hand, of course, you're not required to take notes if you do not want to. That will be left up to you individually. But regardless of whether you choose to take notes, if you would please put your name on the first page of the notepad that's been provided. If you please do that now. All right, thank you. Any notes that you take during this trial will be for your personal use. And to ensure that your notes remain private, please do not write any notes on the first page of the notepad that has your name on it. If you wish, you can use all subsequent pages to write your notes. You will not be allowed to take your notes with you from the courtroom. During recesses, please turn your notepad over, and the bailiffs will ensure that no one will attempt to read your notes. Over the night's recesses, the bailiffs will take possession of your notes and then will return them to you when we reconvene. After the conclusion of the evidence and the arguments of the attorneys and the final instructions on the law by me, you will be allowed to use your notes during deliberations. When you have completed your deliberations, your notes will be destroyed. No one will ever read your notes. This is an important consideration if you do decide to take notes during this trial. Please do not get so involved in note-taking that you become distracted from the proceeding. Your notes should be used only as an aid to your memory. Whether or not you take notes, you should rely on your memory of the evidence, and you should not be unduly influenced by the notes of other jurors. Notes are not entitled to any greater weight than each juror's memory of the evidence. Members of the jury, I'm going to now reread and remind you of the communication rules that you've been instructed on previously. And you must follow these rules until you are discharged from your service as a juror. Jurors must decide this case, and that's without distraction and only on the evidence presented here in the courtroom. Jurors must not conduct any investigation on their own, and this means reading newspapers, watching television, or using a computer, cell phone, the internet, or electronic device, or any other means at all to get information related to this case or the people and places involved in this case. You may not visit the places mentioned during this trial or use the internet to look at maps or pictures to see any place discussed during this trial. You are also not permitted to communicate about this case, and that's with anyone, including your spouse, your family members, friends, neighbors, and even your fellow jurors. The communication with your fellow jurors about this case should only occur when the court instructs you to begin deliberations. During the trial, the court will take recesses, and you will be permitted to separate and go about your personal affairs. It is important to remember that this prohibition on communicating about this case applies during these recesses, whether you're in the courthouse or elsewhere. If at any time you find yourself in a situation where others are discussing this case in your presence, please leave that situation at once and immediately report the matter to the bailiff, who will then advise me. You cannot have your cell phones or other electronic devices here in the courtroom while court is in session. However, you may use these devices during recesses, but you still must follow these communication rules. To ensure your privacy as a juror, please do not take photographs, video recordings, or audio recordings of your fellow jurors while deliberating. You must not communicate with anyone outside the jury room. The jury room has all the electronic equipment that you will need to view the evidence. The jury room does not have a phone or internet capabilities. I know I've explained it, but I'm going to say it one more time. What are the reasons for these rules? If you investigate, if you research, or you make inquiries on your own, I have no way to make sure that the information that you obtained is proper for this case. And the parties likewise would have no opportunity to dispute or challenge the accuracy of what you find, and this is contrary to our judicial system, which assures every party the right to ask questions about and challenge the evidence being considered against it, and to present argument with respect to that evidence. Any independent investigation by a juror unfairly and improperly prevents the parties from having the opportunity that our judicial system promises. Any juror who violates these restrictions jeopardizes the fairness of these proceedings, and a mistrial could result. That would require this entire trial process to start over. A mistrial is a tremendous expense and inconvenience to the party, the court, and the taxpayers. If you become aware of any violation of these rules at all, please notify court personnel of the violation. In conclusion, you should not form any definite or fixed opinion on the merits of this case until you've heard all the evidence, the arguments of the attorneys, and the law, and the instructions on the law by me. Until that time, you should not discuss this case amongst yourselves. You must follow the communication rule. This case must be tried by you only on the evidence presented during this trial, in your presence, in the presence of the defendant, the attorneys, and me. Members of the jury, that concludes the preliminary instructions. I turn the case over for opening statements. State of Florida.
May it please the court.
Ms. Stifler.
Counsel. The Sanctuary neighborhood in Jacksonville Beach, Florida, is exactly what it sounds like. It's a small residential enclave of nice homes with golf carts and boats in the driveway. But on the night of February 16th, 2022, Sanctuary was anything but that for Jared Bridegan. Instead, Sanctuary Boulevard South was the site of his execution. Jared had just dropped off 2 children that he shared with his ex-wife, Shanna Gardner, at her home at Marsh Inlet, about 2.5 miles north of what would be the site of his death. His ex-wife, Miss Gardner, lived there with her new husband, this defendant, Mario Fernandez. Jared dropped his children off and was on his way home to Nocatee, where he lived with his new wife, Kirsten Bridegan, and their 2 daughters. One of his daughters, 2-year-old Bexley Bridegan, was in the car with him. Minutes after he left Miss Gardner's children safely at her home, he reached Sanctuary Boulevard South, where a tire was laying in the road. A dark residential road surrounded on either side by trees with 2 high curbs on each side, one way south, a tree line, and one way north. He put his vehicle in park, put on his flashers, and got out of his car to move the tire. A figure from the darkness stepped out with a firearm and fired 4 10-millimeter bullets, 2 of which went into the vehicle, the passenger compartment, inches from where 2-year-old Bexley Bridegan was strapped in her car seat. 2 of those bullets went into Jared Bridegan. He ended up face down on the pavement of that cold, dark road. He lay there, and Bexley Bridegan remained strapped in her car seat, a seat designed to keep her safe, now held her, unable to move, for nearly 7 minutes until anybody arrived. Due to his injuries, Jared could not get up, and he could not reach her. Every parent's worst nightmare: to die not knowing if any of those bullets had hit his daughter, to die not knowing if she was safe. The person who shot Jared disappeared into the night. There were no witnesses other than Bexley. Nothing. 7 minutes after those gunshots, vehicles started to back up behind Jared's stopped vehicle. 2 people, Shane Borgia and Janelle Cruz, happened to be passing through the area. They got out of their vehicle and walked up to Jared's car with its driver's door open and his flashers on. Shane saw the car, the flashers, and Jared laying face down on the asphalt. Thought it could be a car accident until he saw all the blood and until he saw Bexley in her car seat. He unbuckled her, pulled her out, took her to Janelle. Despite being only 2.5, Bexley was an articulate and intelligent child. Despite it being a warm night for February, she was shaking. She told Janelle, "Something happened to my daddy. I heard loud booms. My daddy's hurt. My daddy's on the ground." She asked, "Are the police going to help my daddy?" Well, police arrived, and unfortunately, they could give Jared no help. Shortly before 8 p.m. on February 16th, Jared Bridegan died face down on that asphalt at Sanctuary Boulevard. Not from a car accident, but from a premeditated murder. A targeted ambush, a planned tactical ambush with a tire in the road in a dark place where no one would see and no one would know and no one would trace it back to those responsible. For one purpose: to kill Jared Bridegan, a killer in the darkness who was picked, hired, solicited for that purpose. And then to disappear into the night. No trace he was ever there. No link to Jared other than being the last person he ever saw on earth. And no trail back to the people who planned and financed Jared's killing. The architects of Jared Bridegan's murder intended it to be the perfect crime. And it almost was. There were no witnesses, but there was an eye in the sky. A surveillance camera, 2 houses down, was able to capture a figure next to Jared's car and the last of the 4 gunshots. That camera captured this figure firing that last gunshot, then walking and then running from frame. Now, standing here in this courtroom 4.5 years later, it seems obvious, goes without saying, that this was an ambush, this was targeted. But that night, it was less so obvious. Officers from the Jacksonville Beach Police Department responded. They were young, they were inexperienced with homicides. Homicides generally don't happen in a neighborhood like Sanctuary, or for Jacksonville Beach for that matter, and certainly not a homicide of a man with his child in the car on a dark road. What you will hear is they began a years-long investigation. They used cutting-edge technology and old-fashioned, boots-on-the-ground, knocking-on-doors police work. A man executed in front of his child by a ghost in the darkness. What was clear from that night, though, was that the manner and method of Jared's death was not consistent with a robbery. Jared's wedding ring, his Apple Watch, his phone, his debit cards were all unseen. Bexley was unharmed. That video, the audio of gunshots and the video of that person calmly walking and then running out of sight showed no dispute. There were no voices picked up. There was no indication of a road rage incident. And then there was that tire. The surveillance that I talked about showed that before Jared's death, minutes before, traffic had been passing unobstructed through that area, meaning that the killer placed that tire in the road seconds before Jared Bridegan got there. That tire was a trap. At that road at Sanctuary, unlike other ones, with those two high curbs and the woods on either side, very dark, no street lights at that time, no cameras, no businesses, and no houses in that immediate vicinity of that road. Feet away from the cut to J. Turner Butler. So dark. Putting a tire in the road that way would virtually guarantee that somebody would have to stop and move it out of the way, rather than risk driving up over those high curbs with those woods on either side. The tire was the trap to get him to stop, to get him to get out of the car, to leave him vulnerable and exposed. That tire was as much the murder weapon that killed Jared Bridegan as the firearm that fired those bullets. So the surveillance clip from police, the figure in the night, the audio of a pattern of gunshots, bang, 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 steady, consistent. All of it combined that night to let the police know what they were dealing with here was not random. This was intentional. This murder was personal. So the question that night for police, who in the world wanted Jared Bridegan dead? Who had the motive? Who would benefit from his death? And over their investigation for years, that answer, and the reason that you are all here in court today, Shanna Gardner, his ex-wife, and her new husband, this defendant, Mario Fernandez. As Mr. Mizrahi told you last week during jury selection, the state of Florida has charged Mario Fernandez with 2 crimes: first-degree murder, premeditated murder, and solicitation to commit a capital offense. Now, the burden is on the state of Florida to prove these charges beyond a reasonable doubt. We welcome that burden. We will do that over the next week and a half by presenting evidence in the forms of exhibits and witness testimony. You will have the law as instructed by the court. You have one more thing, equally as important as those two, that you bring with you into this room and back into that deliberation room. That is your common sense. What will become apparent to you very quickly was the same fact that became apparent to those investigators years ago. No one in the world truly wanted Jared Bridegan dead. No one in the world truly benefited from his death. No one in the world truly had motive to kill him, except for Gardner and Fernandez. A little background. Shanna Gardner and Jared Bridegan were married very young, after a quick courtship. They were both members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which you all may know as the Mormon Church. They were married, they had twin children, they moved from Utah, various places in the country, and ended up in Jacksonville, Florida, because one of their children had a heart condition and needed to live at sea level. Jared was very religious. He wanted to raise the children in the church. At some point during their marriage, Ms. Gardner began to question her religion. She wanted to leave the church. She did not want to raise her children the way that she was raised in the church. They had strife. They got divorced. And in some time had passed, the acrimony of that divorce never did. It remained very bitter between the two of them, despite the fact that they both later remarried. Jared Bridegan remarried Kirsten Bridegan in 2017, and Shanna Gardner remarried this defendant, Mario Fernandez, in 2018. Mario Fernandez and Shanna Gardner met at a gym She was doing workout classes and training. He was the maintenance man. He grew up in Jacksonville. She grew up in a very, very wealthy family in Utah. They had a very short courtship, and then they got married. And their marriage was not one necessarily of true love, but of convenience. It was a deal. His words, not mine. You'll hear that he told police that he married Ms. Gardner to help her with the kids, to help her with the Jared situation, and that they sealed the deal when he talked about their marriage. The two couples co-parented. They did not do so amicably. You will see the court filings. You will see they were in and out of court for years. Big issues, medical treatment, where the kids went to school, small issues, who's going to pay for this, who's going to pay for that. They fought over everything. Can she dye her hair? Who pays for the oxygen tank? They got to the point where they would only communicate, the four of them, in writing. Separate parent-teacher conferences, separate doctor's appointments. It was nasty. It was petty. It was not good on both sides. But Shanna Gardner complained about the custody agreement incessantly. She wanted full custody, particularly because Jared was bringing the children, especially their young daughter, into the church that she now did not want to be a part of, that she now despised. The defendant himself told police after Jared's death that they were seeking full custody, that they wanted full custody, that they would have even been happier with more custody, 60-40 as opposed to the 50-50. The defendant, after Jared Bridegan's death, told police that the kids were better off without him. And the money. Ms. Gardner was from a very wealthy family, and her parents, in order to protect her assets, set up a trust fund for her, the Shanna Gardner Irrevocable Trust Fund. And this defendant was the trustee. She had in the trust a clause that stated that when she had no more legal entanglements with Jared Bridegan, that she could elect to serve as a trustee of her own trust and gain access and control over her money. Before Jared's death, you may hear evidence that Gardner-Fernandez, this defendant, were planning to separate and divorce. He would no longer be trustee over her finances and live in the nice house at Marsh Inlet that her parents bought for them and drive his Toyota Tundra that was purchased for him during the marriage. They had also decided to separate. They were not in love. This marriage of convenience had run its course. And then Jared Bridegan was murdered. And Mario Fernandez and Shanna Gardner remain legally married to this day. 4 months after the death, the defendant remained the trustee on her trust. A week after Jared Bridegan's death, the defendant transferred $50,000 from Shanna Gardner's trust into his own personal checking account. 4 months after Jared Bridegan's death, they continued to live together until they separated. He gained half the proceeds of the sale of their home at Marsh Inlet that her parents had purchased. He sold the Tesla that they had during the marriage. He sold the Toyota Tundra they had during the marriage. And he continued to move money around. Ms. Gardner got what she wanted, full control over her children and the freedom to move out of Jacksonville, Florida. 6 months after Jared's death, she left the state of Florida without the defendant, her legal husband, and moved to Washington State with her 2 children into a home purchased by her parents through an LLC. Mr. Fernandez eventually moved to Orlando. The facts I just told you are undisputed. You're going to see bank records, court.
I'll sustain it. You can rephrase.
The facts that I just described to you come from the records themselves, bank records, the court filings, interview of the defendant, the witnesses who will take the stand. Clearly, they had motive. They benefited greatly from Jared's death. And the detectives with the Jacksonville Beach Police Department knew this. They heard this. They conducted hundreds of interviews. They pulled bank records. They pulled phone records. They knew that these people had a motive. And although they were suspicious, they did not rush their investigation. They looked at every possible lead, which were few and far between, given the nature, the method, the manner of Jared's death. They also learned that other than Gardner and the defendant, there were no other true individuals with actual motive to have Jared killed.
Grounds. Okay. Is that better? Okay. All right, you may proceed.
Thank you, Your Honor. You will hear that the Jacksonville Beach Police conducted an investigation which uncovered that there were no other suspects with a true motivation to kill Jared Bridegan. They interviewed Jared's widow, Kirsten Bridegan. They spoke to his family members. They spoke to his friends. They spoke to his coworkers. They spoke to anybody in the past that had any type of argument or dispute with him. They followed every lead they possibly could. They went to his home. They got his work laptop, his hard drive, his personal laptop, his phone. They extracted them. They downloaded them. His widow, Mrs. Bridegan, provided police with passwords and access. She let them into her home and showed them where her husband had kept his firearms. What they learned about Jared Bridegan through his digital life and through these interviews with those that knew him best was that he was a risk-averse person. He worked from home. He had a very small circle, few friends, family, few hobbies. There was no evidence uncovered through their search of his devices or through interviews that he was in any kind of gambling debt, any significant financial debt. He had no criminal record, no history of arrests. There were no drugs in his talk screen, no indication that he was buying or selling drugs, no indication from his devices or for interviews that he was having an affair, that he had an ongoing long-term dispute with anybody, save them. He didn't go out partying. He didn't travel. He lived in Nocatee. He worked from home. And he led a quiet life. He attended church every Sunday and was devoutly Mormon. So not only did the police learn of the motive of Ms. Gardner and Mr. Fernandez, the defendant, they also learned through investigation and through following leads and talking to everybody and anybody that could potentially have any information, that there appeared to be nobody else with a motive to kill Jared Bridegan. Like I said, they didn't jump to conclusions. They pulled phone records and financial records for his widow, for family members. They tried to use cutting-edge investigative techniques, some things you'll learn about during this trial, like tower dumps and geofence. They cobbled together what surveillance they had. Nothing turned up a significant lead that sent them anywhere. They went door to door to door through the miles of homes in Jacksonville Beach, knocking, looking for eyewitnesses, looking for surveillance video. Nobody saw the murder. Nobody could give them a suspect description. They had nothing but a shadowy figure on the screen. They had the manner of death, that this was personal and targeted. And they had some other things that the killer had left behind. Very little. What they had was the tire in the road. The tire had a rim on it that they were able to identify through OPM records, manufacturer records, that it belonged to a Ford F-150. And when they learned that, they started looking on surveillance. They found Jared's vehicle, the black VW Atlas, which is what he drove, and they saw that minutes and seconds before he reached Sanctuary, where he was killed, that there seemed to be a vehicle in frame with his vehicle. And that vehicle was a blue Ford F-150 with a tan stripe along the running board. So they expanded their surveillance search. They found more video of that particular vehicle. You will see a compilation of clips of that truck that they identified through hundreds of hours of video that they poured over. You will see that that blue truck, F-150, arrived to Jacksonville Beach around 5:45 p.m. on Beach Boulevard, that it drove down through the back residential winding roads that Jared would have taken from the defendant's home at Marsh Inlet to Sanctuary, where he was killed, before the homicide. That it drove down Sanctuary Boulevard South, that same eye in the sky that caught that figure, miraculously also was triggered by someone taking out their trash. And it caught a blue Ford F-150 with a tan running board driving down Sanctuary an hour before the murder, slowing down and almost appearing to stop at the very site where Jared would be killed an hour later. It caught that car coming back up, driving around, and then pulling in to an apartment complex cut, an area called Pablo Hamlet at Cheddar, a street north of the homicide scene in Jacksonville Beach, a street where this blue truck that was seen slowing at the homicide scene and then driving away from the homicide scene shortly after Jared was killed, waited for a period of about 20 minutes before Jared's death. And this street, Cheddar, this Pablo Hamlet area, isn't just anywhere in Jacksonville Beach. It is exactly one street over and directly behind that house in Marsh Inlet where Shanna Gardner and Mario Fernandez lived. Detectives followed that surveillance of the blue truck. They saw it in front of Jared seconds before his death. It appeared to be moving fast, as if trying to put distance between itself and Jared's vehicle, as if trying to create time, perhaps to lay down a tire and set a trap. That blue vehicle was seen driving north away from the homicide scene after the gunshots. That blue truck was seen before the homicide on surveillance with what appeared to be an object in its bed, consistent with a tire. At 6:41 p.m. on Grande Boulevard, a camera picked up that truck, the tire in the back. At 7:54, minutes after the homicide, that same camera at Grande picked up that truck, this time going north, away from the homicide scene, and that tire was not in the bed of the truck anymore. The detectives felt like this was the first real lead. This vehicle, it was an older model. It was a blue truck with a running stripe that was tan on the bottom. It was unique enough that they could move on it. They could put it out there. They released a photo to the public. They begged for tips. They asked for people to call in. Has anybody seen this truck? Because the surveillance was too grainy to make out a license plate or even the state of the tag. And Jacksonville Beach at this time did not have what we call license plate readers. All they had was a make, a model, and a general appearance. But no legitimate leads came in. And the trail on the truck for some time went cold. The other piece of evidence that the killer left behind was the expelled cartridge casings from the firearm used to kill Jared Bridegan. When you fire a semi-automatic handgun, the cartridge, or what we in layman's terms usually say bullet or ammo, the projectile is expelled, and the cartridge, or shell casing, as some people might call it, is ejected. In this case, the killer took the gun with him when he fled, but he did not pick up the shell casings. So those 4 shots, 4 10-millimeter cartridge casings or shells were left behind at the homicide scene. And detectives had something to work with there Because although there are 10 millimeters manufactured and distributed, it is not the most common caliber firearm. It's not like a 9 or a 40. It gave them something to look into. And not only was it a 10 millimeter firearm used and 10 millimeter ammunition, an expert from the Florida Department of Law Enforcement will tell you that they are able to determine it most likely came from a Glock 10 millimeter firearm. Because when it's shot, it leaves a certain pattern from the firing pin, consistent with a Glock, consistent with their proprietary design. And not only was it most likely a Glock 10 millimeter, it was probably an older model Glock 10 millimeter. So the detectives tracked down every FFL sale of a 10 millimeter firearm in the months preceding the homicide. They pulled pawn records for 10 millimeters pawned, and they worked with the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office NIBIN unit, a National Integrated Ballistics Information Network, to try to track down any 10 millimeter that they could. And they followed up on it. They figured out who purchased 10 millimeters from FFLs. They figured out who pawned 10 millimeters. They sent officers out to talk to these people, to look at their names, to run their records, to see if there was any connection to any of them in Jared Bridegan through his phone records, bank statements, or device downloads, through interviews with his friends and family, and there were none. And lastly, they had the time and place of Jared's death as a clue. Although not physical evidence, that gave them information as well. Because the path that Jared Bridegan took from Marsh Inlet to Sanctuary is a windy path through a residential area. It's a cut through. Unless you live in the neighborhood or are familiar with it, most likely you're not driving that route. And they knew that the tire had not been in the road until moments before Jared's death. So they knew the killer had to have known, one, that Jared Bridegan would be in Jacksonville Beach that night, even though he lived and worked in Nocatee. Two, that he would be driving a black VW Atlas. And three, that he would be going down Sanctuary at that exact moment, the right time for the killer to execute his plan and execute Jared. And there were not that many people in the world that knew that Jared Bridegan would be in Jacksonville Beach that Wednesday night, February 16th, 2022, at approximately those times. But some people did, including Shanna Gardner and the defendant, Mario Fernandez. Because part of their custody arrangement for this 50-50 parental time sharing was that on the week that the parents did not have the twins, they would get a date night with them. So on the weeks where the twins were at Gardner and Fernandez's, Jared Bridegan would come to Jacksonville Beach, pick up the twins, and take them out to dinner. And they called it date night. And it was always Wednesday night, every other Wednesday night. And it was always around the same time, between 6:30 and 8 p.m. So the killer had to have known about date night, or that Jared would be there that night, because February 16th, 2022 was a Wednesday night and was a date night. That's why he was there, picking up and dropping off the children. And the killer had to have known that Jared would be in his black VW Atlas. And in order to kill Jared Bridegan and leave no witnesses behind, the killer would have known that Jared would be with his daughter Bexley, but that his wife, Kirsten Bridegan, would not. That she had given birth to their second daughter 6 months ago and had not been going on date night for the past couple months. So the killer had a blue truck, a tire, a 10 millimeter firearm, and information about Jared Bridegan's whereabouts in order to successfully carry out the plan to kill him. And the detectives followed these leads as best they could, and the trail ran cold. And they kept coming back to the names Shanna Gardner and Mario Fernandez as they eliminated other possibilities. They continued to follow every lead. And months passed, and they decided to start expanding their interviews, talk to everybody and anybody, no matter how insignificant they seem, to see if they have any information. When doing this in July of 2022, a few months after Jared's death, and a month or two after the trail had gone cold, they ended up at a residence in the Jacksonville's northwest side, 5239 Potomac Avenue, just near Edgewood and Kings Road, a little north of the Paxton area, if you're familiar. And it's about 40 minutes from Jacksonville Beach. 5239 Potomac is a home owned by this defendant, Mario Fernandez. He was using it as a rental property, and it was managed by an LLC called First Choice Home Rentals, an LLC that was incorporated by Mario Fernandez and Shanna Gardner. They were joint business partners. This house is not like the Marsh Inlet house or the houses in Sanctuary. You'll see photographs of the house, of the state of its disrepair. Rent there was not expensive. In July of 2022, detectives went to that home because they knew Mr. Fernandez was a landlord and was renting the property, and they spoke to the tenants there. A man named Jeremy Ordway, and another man arrived while they were there, a former tenant named Henry Tenen. And while detectives were speaking to Mr. Ordway and Henry Tenen, they noticed against the side of the house an old tire. It had been put out for garbage collection, and by some stroke of luck, they happened to be there that day and happened to see it before it was taken to the dump. They took that tire, collected it, brought it back to the Jacksonville Beach Police Department, and compared it to the tire left at the crime scene, the tire used as a trap, the tire used to murder Jared Bridegan. And they realized it was the same make and model. It had the same DOT number, meaning it was manufactured by Michelin in the same factory the same week as the tire from the crime scene. That was the first real lead that blew the case open. Here's this tire leaning against the house that this defendant owns. And they realized very quickly that the man that arrived at the house, Henry Tenen, owned a blue and tan, two-toned, older model Ford F-150 Lariat that he had inherited from his father. Who is Henry Tenen? I wish I could have the picture. Henry Tenen is a man in his now late 60s and mid 60s around the time of this homicide. Henry Tenen has a 12th grade education. He has limited family in Georgia. He's a convicted felon. He is a day laborer. He worked for a pallet company. Pallets are those big wooden pallets that they use to stack equipment, and his job was to take old pallets and break them down into pieces. It's heavy manual labor, and he got paid by the piece, not by the hour, not a salary. He got paid by the piece. Detectives pulled his bank records. His bank account was frequently overdrawn. He was back due on child support. His wages at the pallet company where he worked were being garnished. Through the majority of 2022, he was essentially homeless. He was sleeping on couches. He was sleeping on a couch at 5239 Potomac Avenue because his friend, the tenant, Mr. Ordway, let him. He was living, as they say in Potomac, pillow to post. He had been a tenant at one point at the Potomac Avenue home, but had been evicted in early 2022 when Mr. Ordway began leasing the property in January of 2022. Henry Tenen's only connection to Jared Bridegan is this defendant, Mario Fernandez. Detectives began looking into him. They were able to find his tag registration. They were able to find that he owned a truck similar to the one they saw on surveillance video, similar to the murder truck. So they arrested him in August of 2022 for driving charges, driving on a suspended license. To further their investigation, they were able to obtain a phone off of his person. They were able to get a set of car keys from his pocket that belonged to a Ford F-150, even though he was driving a Crown Vic, and even though there was no sighting or sign of the truck that he had inherited from his father. They pulled his bank records from his phone. They were able to obtain a phone number, an email address, and they were able to get Google location data, something you'll hear about during this trial. Something that existed and was new at the time and now is no longer kept for law enforcement purposes by Google. A moment in time, detectives were able to get this information. And what it told them was that Henry Tennant's phone number, email address, linked to his Android phone were in Jacksonville Beach the night of February 16th, 2022. And not just in Jacksonville Beach, a block or two away from the homicide scene, minutes after Jared Bridegan was killed. And from that location data, detectives were able to go back to that surveillance they collected, and they were able to identify a black male on camera walking from the homicide scene and walking throughout Jacksonville Beach after the murder. And in that video, they were able to determine that the person had a jacket and a pair of boots that looked very, very, very similar to a jacket and a pair of boots that they collected from 5239 Potomac Avenue belonging to Henry Tennant. They eventually found his truck in the yard of a family friend. Henry Tennant's vehicle. A vehicle that looked very similar to this vehicle before the homicide, driving on Grande Boulevard with a tire in the back bed, leaving the homicide scene after the murder with no tire. Most importantly, they got his DNA. His DNA came back on the steering wheel of this blue vehicle. It came back on those keys that were in his pocket for a Ford F-150, keys that unlocked this vehicle. And Henry Tennant's DNA came back on a swab of the inner rim of that tire at Sanctuary Boulevard South that was put in the road to trap and kill Jared Bridegan. Detectives realized Henry Tennant was the shooter. Although they searched and searched, they found no link between Jared Bridegan, Kirsten Bridegan, the Bridegan family, and Henry Tennant. They found no motive for Henry Tennant to have wanted Jared Bridegan dead. The killer was a stranger to Jared Bridegan. The murder was personal. And what you will see this week is the link between the two is this defendant, Mario Fernandez. That link between those leads, between the tire to the truck to the defendant, between the manner of the death, the time and the place and the timing, and this defendant, the investigation the detectives did started with that evidence, and it led to Henry Tennant, and it led right back to Mario Fernandez. And that's a common theme you'll see this week. Everything they investigated that had potential to give actual evidentiary value led from Mario Fernandez to information. And the more they investigated that information, the more they looked into Henry Tennant, the more they looked into the tire, it led right back to Mario Fernandez. You'll see another connection. As they realized that Henry Tennant was involved in this murder, they started to take a harder look at the other associates of Mario Fernandez. Just as the killer was linked to Mario through that truck and tire, you will hear about a link between that 10mm Glock firearm and Mario Fernandez. You will hear about Mario Fernandez's friendship with a man named John Biggerstaff. John Biggerstaff and Mario Fernandez have known each other for decades. He went to high school with Mr. Biggerstaff's children, and they maintained over the years an acquaintanceship and a friendship off and on. They would work out, hang out. You will also hear that John Biggerstaff was a former Navy cryptologist and a former JSO reserve officer until he was federally prosecuted for a felony. He and Mr. Fernandez were in close contact in 2022, leading up to the homicide. You will hear that they spent time together in Mr. Biggerstaff's home in his garage, talking about the custody battle, sharing beers, venting. You will hear that John Biggerstaff is the person that Mario Fernandez called after hearing about the murder of Jared Bridegan. One of his first contacts, one of his first calls was to John Biggerstaff in the early morning hours of February 17th, after police let them know Jared Bridegan had been killed. You will hear that Mario Fernandez was at John Biggerstaff's house the night before the murder, February 15th into the early morning hours of February 16th. And you will hear that Mario Fernandez spent February 17th, the day after Jared's murder, with John Biggerstaff. And this is significant because when John Biggerstaff became a convicted felon and was fired from JSO, he had to surrender his firearms, and he surrendered them to his son, Juan Biggerstaff. One of the firearms that he surrendered was a Glock, older model, 10mm firearm. So detectives investigated. They spoke to Mr. Biggerstaff. They spoke to his son, Juan. They tracked down purchase records. They were trying to find this firearm. You will hear from the Florida Department of Law Enforcement expert that if you have shell casings left behind on a scene and you have a firearm, you can test fire it, you can compare those casings, and you can scientifically determine if casings on a scene were fired by a certain gun. So the police obviously wanted to obtain Mr. Biggerstaff's Glock 10mm to see if it was the weapon used to kill Jared Bridegan or not. And they are unable to do that to this day because Mr. John Biggerstaff and his son, Juan Biggerstaff, have forgotten where this firearm is. They just don't know. They can't produce it. They can't tell anyone where it is. We have been unable to find it and to test it to see whether or not that was the firearm used to kill Jared Bridegan. A gun we don't have because the defendant's close friend that he hung out with the day before the murder and the day after the murder can't produce his Glock 10mm firearm. And like Henry Tenen, John Biggerstaff has no connection to Jared Bridegan or to Kirsten Bridegan or to the Bridegan family. Another piece of evidence that we found by starting with Mario Fernandez that led right back to him. Another link between two people who are strangers to Jared Bridegan and this defendant. These links, or coincidences, as they might be called by defense during this case, are numerous. Jared had no connection to Henry Tenen, but someone had to tell him what vehicle he was in. Henry Tenen has no connection to Sanctuary neighborhood, but this route was specific. This ambush was pre-planned, given that evidence of that truck driving it before the murder. Someone had to have shown him where to go. Henry Tenen would not have known about date night unless someone told him. And Henry Tenen happened to kill Jared Bridegan with a Glock 10mm firearm, a relatively unusual firearm that someone had to give him. Henry Tenen, a tenant of Mario Fernandez, happened to kill the one person standing between this defendant and remaining in his marriage and profiting from that marriage to Shanna Gardner, and standing between Ms. Gardner and her ability to control her own money, control her freedom, and control her children. Those are the coincidences, as they might call them, you will hear about in the next 2 weeks. And the defendant and Ms. Gardner profited from the death of Jared Bridegan, as did Henry Tenen. You will also hear evidence that when they recovered Henry Tennant's truck, inside the truck were 3 check stubs, still together, with numerical markings. And the police were able to go into Henry Tennant's bank records, find those check numbers, and see that Henry Tennant, in March and April of 2022, weeks after Jared's death, deposited 3 checks written by Mario Fernandez, the defendant. He deposited a $2,000 check with a subject line landscaping. He deposited a $3,000 check with the subject line keeping up with the roof. And he deposited a $5,000 check written by this defendant to the shooter that said, Kickstarter, good luck, exclamation point, exclamation point. Well, you'll see photos of the house at Potomac. You'll see its roof. You'll see its landscaping. You'll see the state of the home. You'll see Mr. Tennant's bank records and the fact that he was frequently overdrawn on his accounts, that he's a day laborer whose wages are being garnished by the government for back-due child support. You will not hear any evidence from the downloads of Henry Tennant's phones or Google accounts that he ever had a Kickstarter. And you will see very quickly that there are no way these are legitimate payments. You will have Mr. Fernandez's Google download, which contains his business dealings with First Choice Home Rentals as it relates to 5239 Potomac. And you'll see the difference between the legitimate expenditures he's giving to LLCs and air conditioning companies with invoices and estimates and scheduled times and emails versus these checks that just magically appeared out of nowhere for $10,000 to a man who earns $15,000 a year breaking down pallets. These checks were a way to hide money for a murder hidden in plain sight to make it look legitimate, with the hope that Henry Tennant would never be identified and no one would ever look that deep. Nobody during this trial is going to be able to take the stand and tell you about the conversations between Henry Tennant and Mario Fernandez regarding this murder. Henry Tennant has been charged. He will not be testifying as a witness, nor will Ms. Gardner. And you will hear evidence from phone records that Henry Tennant, despite not being a tenant of Mr. Fernandez past January of 2022, had multiple text messages and phone calls with the defendant in February and March of 2022 when he wasn't a tenant. Multiple phone calls and texts. I'm talking 70 text messages and calls in February 2022. You will hear that none of those text messages, the content, the call logs, exist on Henry Tennant's phones or devices. Henry Tennant deleted his contact with this defendant, Mario Fernandez. You will also hear that shortly after Henry Tennant was arrested in August 2022 on those driving on a suspended license charges unrelated to the murder, that Mario Fernandez, this defendant, factory reset, wiped his cell phone. Not just deleted. You'll hear from a forensic expert what it means to wipe your phone. What you lose, all the apps, all the passwords, financial records, banking records, every photograph someone has ever taken on their phone, gone, wiped. After his tenant, ex-tenant, is arrested on unrelated charges. You will also hear from his Google return that Mr. Fernandez deleted Henry Tennant as a contact in his Google Cloud, that he deleted over 6,000 records from his Google account. This is what we call consciousness of guilt. It's evidence you can consider this week as you evaluate what the state has presented. But you will not hear someone come in and say, Mario Fernandez paid me to kill Henry Tennant. Two people can keep a secret if one of them's dead, and for purposes of this trial, Henry Tennant is dead to you. He is not on trial. Shanna Gardner is not on trial. But the evidence of their consciousness of guilt is evidence of this defendant's guilt. We can't say where Mario Fernandez was during the time of the homicide. We know from surveillance, and you will see on the surveillance, that Henry Tenen is on foot for hours in Jacksonville Beach after the murder, about an hour and a half, trying to get out of Jacksonville Beach. You will also see surveillance that the blue truck with that tire in the back that left the homicide scene without that tire is separated from Henry Tenen, which means two people were there that night. One driving the truck, one person, Henry Tenen, murdering Jared Bridegan. Mario Fernandez's cell phone has the ability to tell us where he is through cell site location, your tower. And you'll hear a lot of evidence this trial about it from a lot of experts. But what you will hear is that Mario Fernandez has no cellular data or location data for the time of the murder. And again, you may hear argument of coincidences and network connectivity. But there's data before the murder, there's data after the murder, and there is no data during the murder. And because Mario Fernandez wiped his cell phone, the expert who would have been able to go in and look at his phone and say it was on airplane mode, it was off, it was on, it was at home using Wi-Fi, does not have that information to tell you that definitively. There's no DNA putting Mario Fernandez at the crime scene. There are no eyewitnesses. There's no video footage that captures the individuals or individual in the truck clearly enough to make them out. These things are all true. The phone at home, lack of DNA, no eyewitnesses. But it cannot change the fact that there is no connection between the shooter and Bridegan other than this defendant. It cannot change the fact that this defendant paid a man $10,000 for work that didn't happen and a Kickstarter that doesn't exist. You will also hear about some activity on the defendant's phone and Mr. Tenen's phone before the murder, about a trip that Tenen's phone took to St. Johns County, to Nocatee, to the street where Jared Bridegan lives, 2 weeks before the homicide. A trip in a blue two-tone truck from Potomac to Jared Bridegan's house, to the crime scene and back to Potomac. A trip that Henry Tenen took while Mario Fernandez's phone was at the house at Potomac Avenue, not being used, stationary in one cell tower coverage area. No link between Henry Tenen and Jared Bridegan other than this defendant. I started my opening today describing the final moments of Jared Bridegan's life and the final moments that Bexley Bridegan had with her father as she witnessed him dying. I began that way to remind you of why we are here. Mr. Dreiser talked at jury selection about this case and media attention and the popularity of verdicts. A trial is about the state's ability to prove a charge beyond a reasonable doubt with evidence, not emotion, with facts, not feelings. But this is not a true crime podcast. This is not a TV show. This is real life. And the reason I started that way is so that does not get lost on you this week. That a man was wiped off the face of the earth in front of his daughter, and he died in a terrible way. I don't say this to inflame you. I say this so you remember why we are here. Our job is to prove the case beyond a reasonable doubt. Defense job is to defend their client. Your job is to return a verdict consistent with the law and the evidence. You will be answering those two questions Mr. Mizrahi brought up. Was a crime committed? Did the defendant do it? Did Mario Fernandez have the intent that Jared Bridegan be killed? And did he incite, cause, encourage, assist, hire, or solicit him to do that? Was he a principal to the death of Jared Bridegan? That is your question to answer with the evidence, the law, and your common sense. We are confident at the conclusion of this trial, your verdict will be consistent with the evidence and the law. We are confident that you will return a verdict of guilty as charged.
Thank you, Ms. Stifler. Members of the jury, we're going to take a brief recess. We will return back in session at 11 a.m.